So I'm going to talk a bit about how we try to apply understanding energetics and biological systems on Earth to these questions that we've been hearing about all week and in the plenary this morning about how could we tell if there might be life on ocean worlds. And so it's really difficult because we don't often know a lot about the specific oxidants or reductants or gradients in these ocean worlds. And even on Earth, it's really hard to predict what kinds of redox reactions, even abiotic ones, you might find in any particular environment. So we've been working a lot with the JPL Electrochemical Technologies Group, who is a big leader in building batteries and fuel cells in interesting conditions for spaceflight. And so we've been trying to apply some of this technology to give us an experimental methodology to try to simulate some electrochemical systems you might get on ocean worlds, not just biotic ones, but also abiotic ones. And so, as you all know, hydrothermal vents are very interesting for life and for life's origin because they provide geochemical gradients. So things like when the ocean has oxidants in it, and in modern Earth it's oxygen, but on early Earth you could have had things like CO2 or ferric iron or nitrate. So there's a variety of possible oxidants you could have. And this also could vary with space and also depending with which planet we're talking about. And then the rock type and the water chemistry will provide you with reductants, things like maybe hydrogen or sulfide or methane. And then the minerals that precipitate around these, and when these fluids mix, you can get precipitation of catalytic minerals, so things like iron sulfides or iron hydroxides or other metal sulfides. And so it's important to understand, if you're looking for life on an ocean world, which electron donors and acceptors are likely, but just because you have an electron donor or acceptor doesn't mean that metabolism would be dominant, because it also depends on how much energy there is, but also the minerals that are present in these systems could affect that. So, for example, if you had a mineral in the vent that is consuming one of your favorite electron acceptors, that's not great because then it's not there for life. And so we are trying to figure out a good experimental system to figure out what metabolites are actually going to be present, and then how can this also interplay with a possible prebiotic chemistry. And so when we're looking at, say, Europa or Enceladus, we don't really know much about exactly what the type of vents would be. And also we have to consider these planets over their whole history. So maybe Enceladus is young, maybe it's not. Maybe in the early history of Enceladus, when it was still really actively serpentinizing, you might have more energy or different types of energy than you could have today. So in an experimental system, we want to be able to, have it be modular and vary these types of things, but also to isolate individual redox reactions and figure out exactly what is catalyzing what and which things could be linked together. So hydrothermal vents are sometimes referred to as geochemical fuel cells because in many ways they behave like a fuel cell that you would see in a battery context. They have a reductant which comes up from the seafloor, and if you have a chimney made of conductive material, electrically conductive, so stuff like iron minerals, the electrons, if you can oxidize that reductant, they could flow through that mineral, and then on the surface of the chimney exterior you kind of have this electrode situation, like a geoelectrode as we call it, where you could maybe reduce some oxidant in the seawater. So this has actually been observed in the field, and it's been proposed that this could also be something important for the origin of life. For example, if you had a CO2-rich ocean, if you could reduce CO2 on these geoelectrodes, you could start making organics that way. This could also work for things like the nitrogen species, nitrate or nitrite, but it could also be a mechanism for habitability on the ocean worlds. So that you don't just have to be living off of the soluble substrates that come out of the vent. You could have life that can do extracellular electron transfer, actually taking the electron directly from the mineral surface. And so the redox reactions that could be physically linked to power an ecosystem or a prebiotic reaction, you have to figure out which are the two sides of the fuel cell and can they be electrically linked or not. So what we've been trying to do at JPL, this is now we're getting into kind of our just ideas we have for the ways you could do such an experiment, and we hope to find collaborators and ideas of how to refine this. So if you actually were to build a fuel cell to simulate a vent, you would want to have the hydrothermal fluid, which is your fuel, and you would choose a specific reductant to go in there. Then on the oxidant side, that would represent your ocean, and you would choose one oxidant to go there. And then a fuel cell is built of these two reservoirs that are connected over a membrane, and the membrane's usually made of Nafion, which is a proton conductor. So you want to have ion exchange, but you also want to have each side of the membrane coated in a catalyst. So in a real fuel cell, these are things like platinum because you're trying to make the best battery. But in this experiment, we want to make the catalyst, the cathode, and the anode side represent the kind of minerals you would see in the geochemical system. So basically, we want to find ways to make geological material or analog planetary material into electrodes in a fuel cell and then pump relevant oxidants and reductants through it. So in a previous paper, we showed that this is a possibility. So we took a sample from a black smoker vent. This is an iron sulfide and other metal sulfide mix. And this can be done in general with other minerals too. So actually, paint is made of mineral particles mixed with ethanol or paint thinner, right? And so you can make paint out of any rock that you really want to. So we have this rock, you grind it up really small, you get very small particles like a few micron in size. We mix that up with a binder. You can also add catalyst to it if it's not reacting well enough. You can put some Nafion in there. So in figure C there, that's the ink that we made out of a rock. And so that ink can then be spray painted, or painted with a brush, if you like, onto the two sides of a Nafion membrane. And you could use the same paint for both sides, or you could use two different paints if you think the outside and inside of a chimney would have different compositions. So then we put that in the fuel cell, and then we have two graphite plates, one on either side, and each one is flowing fluid through it. One has the vent fluid, and one has the ocean. And then we can see if this reacts the same way that you observe it in the field. So for this system, we were simulating a modern-day black smoker because that's where you get a sample from. And so you would expect oxygen as an oxidant, and then in this case, it was hydrogen sulfide as a reductant. And so we observed in this hydrothermal fuel cell thing that we built that we were actually able to see sulfide oxidation, which is not super surprising because sulfide is very easy to oxidize. But we also observed oxygen reduction that was coupled to the sulfide oxidation, and it was driven by the presence of these minerals. So in a control where we had no minerals, we didn't observe this reaction going. So this can show you, this is abiotic, but it can show you that you would have these things present, and either side of the fuel cell could be abiotic, but it could be linked to a biotic system. And so now if we're going to think about how to apply this to ocean worlds, it's always kind of theoretical about which exact environments we can simulate. So now, it gets a little speculative. But on Earth, we know that the life is found at pretty much all pressures in the ocean that we've found. There's also lots of subsurface life even below that. So we haven't really found the pressure limit of life yet, which means that if you're looking at a small world like Enceladus, where the pressure at the seafloor is only going to be about 70 bar, but Enceladus' deep interior is kind of analogous pressure-wise to Earth's average ocean depth. And so because life on Earth can live at all these pressures, if you had Enceladus or another planet that had a lot of fractures in the subsurface, you might have life not just at vents, but also kind of in the rocks below, and who knows how far deep in the core if the water could get in there. So we want to simulate not just the actual vent, but the kind of the sediments around it, and then the rocks and minerals below. So this is a simulation of what you might see on Enceladus and possible metabolisms that have been proposed. So for Enceladus, let's say if you're having a serpentinizing system that makes hydrogen, maybe methane, you could have methanogenesis if there's CO2, but you could also have other metabolisms that use that hydrogen. It's not just methanogenesis that's possible. You could also consume the methane with something like, say, ferric iron. And so if you have minerals present as electrodes that are mixed valence and reactive, you could actually use those as metabolites as well. So here's an example of the fuel cell, and one funny thing that we found originally was that this graphite fuel cell the surface of the graphite was really reactive. So the sulfide was oxidizing, but it was oxidizing all the time. And it's because you have to make your material choices very cleverly for this. So we have a new fuel cell that is a custom-made version that's made of plastic, and so it's inert electrochemically, but it's also not giving us fake organic signatures. So choosing materials here is important because the things that you would normally pick to make a good fuel cell are not what you want for this type of experiment. So if we have a cathode and an anode, in this case, the anode is going to be the interior and the cathode will be the exterior. You could have a chimney environment, and so life can live in chimneys. This is great. It can kind of interface directly with the ocean. And so we could make simulated chimneys in lab. You could get samples from things that are analogous on Earth. So that's one possibility that we could simulate here. Another possibility is if you have plumes and sediments forming near a vent, those sediments can be very reactive too. So you can get things like sulfides, hydroxides, metal oxides, and those are great as well for electrocatalysts. So we can either make simulated sediments and then make paint from that, or we can get different types of sediments from the field. Or you can go deeper and consider things like, say, chondrite-rich rocky core, because chondrites will have bits of metallic iron nickel, and meteorite material is definitely very electrochemically reactive. This has been shown in several studies. So if you imagine the Enceladus not quite yet serpentinized, but also pretty chondritic with iron nickel chondrite stuff in there, you could get some reactions going on there as well, and all of this links to make a fairly complex abiotic/biotic electrochemical system. So any of these, or all of these, could be your geocatalyst. And so the thing to consider is that on Earth, we see a lot of examples where biological systems are linked physically to something farther away. So you have a lot of synergy going on with different microbial communities. You can have one, say, doing redox at like the bottom of a sediment column, but then you have conductive sediment material that then connects that physically to another colony at the top. And so what if you had something like this on an ocean world where there's one bacteria or archaea doing something at one location, and then it's connected with minerals that are conductive like a wire to some abiotic reaction or a prebiotic reaction? So in that sense, maybe the origin of life or the prebiotic stuff that's happening is also kind of linked to the emerging metabolism, and it's not all one event. So an example of a abiotic yet pretty organic looking reaction that might end up being linked here, I presented a more detailed version of this on Wednesday, but you can have, for example, iron hydroxide minerals that are very catalytic, and if you have simple organic molecules produced in vents or delivered from meteorites, those can react to give you other stuff like amino acids or alpha hydroxy acids. And so this is a redox reaction driven by a mineral that's not biological, but would be a pretty confusing thing to see if you're trying to determine a biosignature. And so if this could be linked to something more biological, for example, a sulfide oxidation by a microbe on, let's say, a metal sulfide or a chondritic type surface, and that could be electrically linked in the fuel cell to something that's abiotic or prebiotic. So one of the technical challenges we faced is that you have to be able to actually conduct those electrons from one side to the other, and it's hard when the minerals aren't actually touching the electrode surface. So we've been developing different ways to do that, and one of those is to have this mesh of a metallic mesh that connects to the mineral, and then that conducts the electrons to the other side. And the important thing is that when you do this in an actual fuel cell, you separate the two sides of the redox reaction, and that way you can tell exactly which half reaction is causing which product, as opposed to, say, a full bottle or a closed system where you just get products out, but you might not know what exactly is catalyzing what. So fuel cells can be fairly useful in this regard. Again, inert plastic is important because when the fuel cell is reactive, your experiments don't make any sense. So in conclusion, if we're going to consider hydrothermal redox chemistry on other worlds, both for the origin of life or for life to survive, it's not just what energy is present, it's also how are the minerals reacting with those supposed electron donors or acceptors, and how does it affect their availability for life? And so this probably requires some modeling as well, and an understanding, which prebiotic reactions are most favored, and could you link those together electrochemically over what kinds of distances even? So for Enceladus, possible oxidants include lots of interesting things, like what about sulfate, or nitrous oxide? And then possible reductants could include things like ferrous iron, or hydrogen, or methane. And we could do tests in this fuel cell to determine, to differentiate between hypotheses of, say, biogenic versions of any of these things that you might eventually see in a plume. And by the way, it is thought that the plume material is coming from deeper below just the seafloor. And so if that's the case, then if you have redox stuff going on below the seafloor, if we could simulate that here, we might be able to predict how to interpret something from a plume that's a potential biosignature. And the mineral catalysts that might be important that we're working on right now for making electrodes include olivine, the iron hydroxides, the phyllosilicates, the chondrites, and so on. So stay tuned, and hopefully an Enceladus fuel cell will yield some interesting results. And so I just want to thank our lab group, the JPL Origins and Habitability Lab, and in particular our collaborators John Paul Jones and Keith Chin. So they're the Electrochemical Technologies group who are using their battery expertise to apply it to astrobiology. And also Ninos Hermes and Erica Flores, who are the grad students who have helped with these experiments. And thank you.